Greetings, everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Avowed has released, I've done a review for it, and I gotta be honest, it absolutely got me back into the mood for Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. And so I decided, you know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and finish our series ranking all of the classes. This is the third video in the class ranking series, and there will be a link to the first video covering Barbarian in the description. If I use terms during this video that you are unfamiliar with, it would probably be a good idea to reference my 2024 Deadfire New Player Guide, and that will be linked in the description as well. Please keep in mind Deadfire has a ton of different gear and consumables that make a wide variety of build options viable. I may say something isn't particularly good, and then someone in the comments will provide examples of armor and or weapons that make the passive or ability really shine. Make sure you glance through the comments because my community loves talking about CRPGs. On that same note, here at Slandered Gaming, you'll constantly see content about CRPGs, so if that interests you, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more videos. Now, let's talk about Ciphers. This class is Obsidian's version of Warlock, providing you with unlimited spellcasting as opposed to most other classes which require the player to rest. Ciphers boast supreme crowd control and damage potential, along with some buffing capabilities as well. They fit in great with just about any team. Ciphers start with a massive 30 rating in will, making them very resistant against enemy crowd control spells. They only get a rank of 15 in reflex, so they are vulnerable to fireballs and similar area of effect damaging spells. They receive a +2 bonus in insight, metaphysics, sleight of hand, mechanics, and bluff. Insight, and to a lesser degree bluff, are fantastic for conversations, and it's critical that at least one member of your party is skilled in mechanics so they can deal with traps and locks. Metaphysics comes up a few times in interesting ways, but on the whole, it isn't an impactful skill. All Cipher abilities require the focus resource in order to cast spells. They generate focus by damaging enemies in either melee or ranged combat. This creates an interesting dynamic where it's critical for you to be a competent spellcaster, but it's equally essential that you are a capable martial combatant so you can generate the focus necessary to use your devastating spells. To that end, you also automatically get Soul Whip, which provides a 20% increase to the damage of your weapons. This sounds great, and it is, but just to be clear, most likely your Cipher's weapon damage will pale in comparison to other classes such as Barbarians or Paladins. Martial Might is just a means to unlock your true potential. There are different trains of thought regarding how best to generate focus. Ranged Ciphers are considered easier to play and provide consistent focus generation. Melee Ciphers require more micromanagement to stay alive, but depending on your build, the damage output could be worth it. Regardless, you'll want to target the weakest enemy first to quickly carve them up and generate initial focus for your abilities. I like using blunderbusses for this, as you can hit a lot of enemies and quickly rack up large amounts of focus, although this playstyle is more dangerous. There are multiple subclass options, but I think they will make more sense after we review the mechanics, so let's look at power level 1. All spells at this level cost 10 focus to use, and each power level increases the focus cost for spells at that rank by 10. By default, at level 1, your Cipher will have a maximum focus of 20. The amount of focus you start combat with is 25% of your maximum focus rounded down. So at level 1, you will begin combat with a rank of 7 focus. That means you will need to attack enemies in order to use any of the power level 1 spells. Your maximum focus increases by 10 every level, and there are other ways to increase it as well. The amount of focus you start combat with will increase accordingly, so you will get to the point that low-level abilities can be used right at the start of combat without you needing to attack enemies at all. The first spell on the list is Mind Wave, and it has the Shred keyword. Make note of the keywords because when we get to subclasses, they become very important. Target one foe within a range of 10 10 meters and hit them with raw damage, while also causing a concussive force that hits enemies behind the target in a cone for crushing damage. This spell interrupts enemies, so it's a great way to keep foes on lockdown while also dishing out decent damage. This isn't bad, but I would skip it for a better option we'll cover in a bit. Whisper of Treason lets you charm an enemy within 4 meters, reducing their intellect and making them align with your party for 15 seconds. It's extremely powerful to take the boss or elite character of a group and then unleash them against their allies. The issue is this spell has to be used in a range of 4 meters, which isn't that bad if you want to turn a melee character, but if the foe you really need to charm is in the back line, reaching them will put your Cipher in serious danger if they are not meant to be within melee distance. Also, when you charm an opponent, they are no longer vulnerable to your abilities that only target enemies. You will still need to kill the enemy once that charm effect has ended. It's a very powerful spell, but you need to choose when to use this wisely. Valorous Echoes applies the strong and insightful buffs to one ally. For the most part, Ciphers are not strong party buffers, and I wouldn't have them focused on that role, but if you really want an easy way to apply these buffs onto a character, then this option is available to you. Antipathetic Field creates a beam between you and one enemy for 6 seconds, dealing corrosive damage to everyone caught in that path and the enemy you are connected with. This spell deals a considerable amount of damage, but unfortunately, the tooltip is incorrect, and consequently, there's a serious downside that isn't immediately clear. The beam also damages party members, so it requires quite a bit of micromanagement if you have multiple melee companions who might step in the way. Personally, I avoid using this. Soul Shock allows you to select one party member within 5 meters to receive a shell that delivers an electrical burst to all nearby enemies. This spell deals considerable damage and has no effect on party members. It's great to use on a tank that is surrounded, and it's my favorite way to damage enemies at PL1. Also note that it targets reflex instead of deflection, making it much more likely to land. In addition, shock is one of the least resisted elements. I definitely recommend picking this up. Tenuous Grasp lets you target one enemy within 10 meters and apply the Shaken and Confused debuffs for 20 seconds. Unlike most of the other spells at this level, the cast time is lightning fast, so this is a very effective way to shut down backline targets early in the game. Last on the list is Eye Strike, which will blind one enemy and all other nearby foes. Blind is a very effective debuff, especially against melee targets, and this will allow you to completely disable powerful melee groups. Definitely an option you want to have. That's all for the spells, so let's go ahead and switch to the passive abilities. Penetrating Visions gives you a +1 penetration bonus with your spells. If you are using a lot of damaging spells, this is definitely worth considering, but if you are mainly focused on crowd control and or buffing, then you can skip this. Iron Will provides a +15 bonus to your will score. Ciphers already get a strong start in will, so offhand I don't believe this is worth it, but hold that thought because there are a couple of situations where you might want to select this that we will cover later. Finally, Lingering Echoes increases the duration of your inflictions by 10%. If you are focused on crowd control spells, then this option is definitely a no-brainer. Alright, now that you understand the basics, let's talk about subclasses. You can either use no subclass, or there are 4 other options. Ascended increases your maximum amount of focus by 5 every other level. Once you have reached max focus during combat, you will gain the Ascended status for 15 seconds, which will increase your power level by 3 and remove the focus cost of casting spells. You'll also deal an additional 20% damage. So usually when playing Cipher, there's a specific spell you want to cast, you attack until there's enough focus to use that spell, and then once it's deployed, you start the process over again. As an Ascendant, you will instead attack until you reach the max focus amount, and then go ballistic with multiple spells back to back. The trade-off is when you are not Ascended, your power level is reduced by 1, negatively impacting any spells you attempt to use. Also, when you are not Ascended, Soul Whip only deals 10% extra damage instead of 20%, but it does generate 50% more focus. In addition, when the Ascended buff goes away, your focus is reduced to 0, so it's a long climb back up. I used this subclass during my live stream playthrough of Pillars of Eternity 2, and it was a blast. Obviously, you won't have much fun if your attacks aren't properly punching through enemy defenses, but as long as you are well prepared, this subclass will let you absolutely obliterate large groups. The next option is Beguiler, and this subclass increases the range of all your deception spells, such as Whisper of Treason, by 20%. If you recall, one of the main drawbacks of those spells is they must be used within 4 meters, so this is very helpful. Even more interesting, your deception spells will restore focus when they are successfully cast on enemies who are vulnerable to sneak attack. As a Cipher, you have a bunch of different debuffs available that can set enemies up in this way, so this is also quite handy. The drawback is your Soul Whip will only provide 10% additional damage and half of its generated focus increase when attacking enemies who are not vulnerable to sneak attack. So the first question is, are you the only person in your party casting large group debuffs? If yes, then I think this subclass isn't worth it, because enemies will only be vulnerable after you set them up. However, if there's a party member who handles debuffing enemies and then you can focus on charming them, that makes things a little bit different. Then you also have to ask if you want your entire playstyle to revolve around charming and dominating enemies when there are many foes who are either highly resistant to these attempts or flat out immune to them. If that doesn't bother you, and to be frank, it doesn't bother me, then this subclass is obviously great. Next up is Soul Blade, and this gives you Soul Annihilation, a melee strike that consumes all of your focus and converts it into raw damage against one target. That probably sounds very inconsequential, but it's because the tooltip is incorrect. Soul Annihilation takes your weapon damage modifiers, and your power level into account when deciding how much damage you deal with this ability. Consequently, you can, no pun intended, absolutely annihilate foes when this is set up properly. Keep in mind that Soul Annihilation is a primary attack, which means it only uses your primary weapon, and therefore Soul Blades benefit tremendously from using two-handed weapons as opposed to dual wielding. Soul Blades can also cast shred spells for 5 less focus, which is very useful early in the game, but irrelevant long term. The disadvantage of this subclass is your max focus will be reduced by 5, and subsequently your starting focus is reduced as well. If you kill an enemy in melee combat, you receive a stack of concentration, along with a plus 10 bonus to your max focus for 30 seconds. Basically, if you want to be a standout melee combatant who can also throw out damaging shred spells with ease, then pick this up, but otherwise, you should skip it. Last on the list is Scion, and this subclass provides the Soul Mind ability, allowing you to regenerate 1 point of focus per second. You also get the Telekinetic Burst ability, which allows you to select an enemy within 8 meters and push them 2 meters back, along with interrupting them. The disadvantage is you completely lose the 20% damage bonus from Soul Whip, and if you receive any damage, then Soul Mind's regeneration ends for 6 seconds. Playing as a telekinetic is fantastic from a thematic standpoint, but mechanically, I would say this is the weakest option on the list. Before we move on, it's probably worth pointing out that there is one more Cipher subclass called Wild Mind, but it's only available to your party member, Seraphim. His abilities can trigger random effects that usually help the party, but sometimes have negative effects. If any of this information was confusing for you, feel free to ask a question in the comments below, or you can join on Discord, link in the description below, where we love talking about all things related to Pillars of Eternity. Alright, now that we have covered the subclass, let's review the rest of the power levels. The first power level 2 spell is Phantom Foes, and this allows you to target one enemy within 10 meters, along with all enemies within 5 meters of that individual, and cause them to believe they are flanked for 18 seconds, setting them up for sneak attacks. If you have party members who can take advantage of this, such as rogues or characters with apprentice sneak attack, then it's a fantastic option. Also note that you can throw it out wicked fast. Mind Blades let you target an enemy within 10 meters and it will deal a small amount of slashing damage. Then it will jump to at most 5 other enemies and do the same thing. The nice thing about this spell is if there are only 2 enemies on the field, it will bounce back and forth between them, dealing quite a bit of damage. So contrary to what you might think, it doesn't work well against large groups, but it will carve up the last two elites in a fight. Recall Agony takes 30% of the damage an enemy receives and applies it again as raw damage for 15 seconds. This is absolutely a boss killer. Put it on enemies right before your team is going to blow them up for big damage and watch their health whittle away. You'll probably want to pick it up regardless of your build. Psycho Vampiric Shield lets you select one enemy within 10 meters and reduces their resolve by 10, while also applying the Steadfast buff to yourself for 20 seconds. That's a substantial reduction to an enemy's will and deflection defenses, so this is worth considering, especially early game. Many enemies mainly depend on deflection to ward off attacks. Next up is Amplified Thrust, which lets you target an ally within 5 meters and then bounce psychic energy off of them onto an enemy, dealing a large amount of pierce damage and pushing them back 3 meters. This is a fantastic single target damage option as it casts lightning fast and hits like a truck. The only disadvantage is it only works against one enemy and usually you will face mobs of foes. Last but certainly not least, we have Mental Binding, one of my favorite crowd control spells in the entire series. This was a monster crowd control spell in Pillars 1, and while it's not quite as effective in Deadfire, it's still great. It lets you target one enemy within 10 meters and paralyze them for 6 seconds, while also immobilizing enemies within 2.5 meters for 10 seconds. Paralyze is one of the most powerful debuffs in the entire game, so this is insanely useful, but 6 seconds isn't a whole lot of time, so you have to carefully plan how to take advantage of this. No question, this spell stops groups of enemies dead in their tracks, and you'll definitely want to pick it up. Moving over to the passives list, the first thing you'll need to decide is what sort of upgrade you prefer to use for Soul Whip. Biting Whip will increase the damage boost to 30%, while Draining Whip will double the amount of focus that you are able to generate. In most cases, I would say Draining Whip is superior, as your Cipher abilities matter significantly more than how much damage your weapons can pump out, but this obviously depends on your playstyle. Alright, now we're moving to PL3, and the first spell on the list is Secret Horrors, which allows you to target one enemy within 10 meters and cause that foe, along with all foes within 2.5 meters, to become frightened and sickened. This is a fantastic way to debuff large amounts of enemies. It is worth noting that this pales in comparison to the wizard spell Ringram's Repulsive Visage, which will sicken and terrify enemies, a much more powerful debuff than Frighten. If you don't have access to that, then Secret Horrors is a great second option. Soul Ignition will allow you to target one enemy within 10 meters and cause them to experience burn damage every 3 seconds for 15 seconds. Personally, I think this damage is too slow, and this is a superior option at this level. Pain Link causes 25% of the damage you take to be dealt towards attackers. Tanks should be avoiding or mitigating most damage, while less well-protected allies won't be able to withstand large amounts of punishment. On the other hand, in a solo run, this could be a fantastic way to help whittle down enemy groups. Ecto-Psychic Echo was the premier Cipher damaging spell in Pillars of Eternity 1, and it's still beastly in Deadfire. Select one ally within 10 meters and create a beam that damages enemies caught within for crushing damage. Unlike Antipathetic Field, this beam doesn't damage party members, although you still need to manage it properly so it's hitting the maximum amount of enemies. Definitely worth picking up. Fractured Volition causes one enemy within 10 meters to become hobbled and weakened, which are both great debuffs to place on enemies, especially if they attack using melee weapons. I prefer debuffs that target entire teams since you will usually face more than one enemy, but this is certainly worth consideration. Puppet Master allows you to dominate one enemy within 8 meters. Unlike charmed foes, dominated enemies can use their spells or abilities, so they are much more powerful combatants, and this is a great option to temporarily turn powerful elites or bosses. Moving on to the passives, we have Psychic Backlash, which can trigger once per encounter when an enemy targets your will saves and causes them to become stunned for 10 seconds. This is a nice effect, but most likely you won't be targeted enough for it to actually be worthwhile, unless you are using the the Cipher as a frontline character. In that case, this makes more sense, but most likely you can skip this option. Hammering Thoughts will provide a +1 bonus to penetration with your weapons, which will allow your weapons to do more damage, and consequently, you will generate focus faster. Definitely an option to consider if you are not satisfied with your results thus far. Moving on to PL4, the first spell is Mind Lance, and this allows you to target one foe within 10 meters and impales them with significant piercing damage, interrupting them in the process. It also does the same thing to all enemies in the path. In the right situation, this is very nice, but I believe the next option is superior. Silent Screen targets one enemy within 5 meters and stuns them for 6 seconds, along with dealing raw damage to the original enemy and all other foes within 2.5 meters. It also interrupts nearby foes, and all the way around, it's a fantastic option for both damage and crowd control. Wild Leech gives a target one random affliction while also providing you with the opposing inspiration. I don't like this because you have no control over what's selected, and these buffs or debuffs do not stack. So if you have a party that's throwing around a lot of afflictions and inspirations, then it's easy for this to do nothing. Even if it does work, it's completely possible that you'll get something that doesn't really help you, or the enemy will get an affliction that has little effect on them. Pain Block applies the robust inspiration for 18 seconds to one ally within 10 minutes. If your tank already has some form of health restoration, stacking robust on top of it can let them heal through quite a bit of damage, so this can be nice to have in a pinch. Body Attunement gives you a +2 armor rating while also removing the same amount from one opponent for 20 seconds. Obviously, this is useful against high armor opponents, but keep in mind that this targets Fortitude, which usually will be very high for enemies with lots of armor. Personally, I don't use this. There's only one Cipher passive at this level, and it's Greater Focus, which increases your maximum focus by 10 and consequently increases your starting focus as well. Absolutely, this is a must-have for the majority of Cipher builds. Ascendants should not take this, as it will only increase the amount of time before you hit maximum focus. So now we're at PL5, and all spells here are going to cost you 50 focus. I would say now we are getting to the point where building up enough focus to use these abilities can be a steep sacrifice. So at PL5 with Greater Focus, your starting focus is 20, and you need to get all the way up to 50 before you can use these abilities, let alone the ones further up. Of course, none of that matters if you are an Ascendant, since you need to reach max focus anyway before you start casting, but it's just something to keep in mind. Borrowed Instinct targets one enemy within 10 meters, reducing their intellect and perception by 8 for 20 seconds, while also giving you a +20 bonus to accuracy and defenses. This is a significant debuff and a monster buff if you are playing as a melee Cipher. It targets Will, which is a low defense for many enemies, so all the way around, it's great stuff. Detonate targets one enemy within 5 meters and delivers a large amount of raw damage. If the target is near death, they explode, dealing crushing damage to nearby enemies and pushing them back 2 meters. No question, this is a fantastic damage option that can really rip up enemies, and don't worry, even if an enemy is destroyed, they still leave behind all of their gear. Ringleader targets one enemy within 4 meters and dominates them for 15 seconds, along with charming all enemies within 2.5 meters. Converting an entire squad of enemies into allies is really an amazing feeling and renders many encounters trivial. No question, if you are focused on crowd control, you'll want to pick this up, even though it has the same short range issue as some other abilities. Echoing Shield targets one ally within 10 meters and gives both that person and all allies within 2.5 meters the Resolute Inspiration. At the same time, it prevents enemies within 2.5 meters from stacking ranks of concentration. This can be brutal against some bosses who use large stacks of concentration to protect themselves from interruption while gearing up devastating attacks. Very situational, but when you need it, you'll be glad you'll have this. Tactical Meld targets one ally within 15 meters, granting them the Aware Inspiration while also increasing the amount of enemies they can engage by 3. Personally, I don't care for this because enemies have a lot of ways to get around engagement, so casting spells that specifically focus on that mechanic doesn't make much sense to me. Moving on to the passives, Keen Mind will give you a +10 bonus to the amount of focus you start combat with, which is obviously absolutely fantastic. You'll definitely want to go ahead and pick this up. There's also Brutal Backlash, which is the upgrade for Psychic Backlash and increases the raw damage amount. There's definitely no reason to take this, as the raw damage is inconsequential and the stun is what truly matters. Moving on to PL6, the first spell is Mind Plague, and it targets one foe within 10 meters and then jumps to at most 5 other enemies, causing all of them to become dazed and confused for 15 seconds. This isn't bad, but there's another crowd control option I like a lot more. Amplified Wave targets one ally within 5 meters and surrounds them with a shockwave that impacts all enemies within 5 meters, dealing a large amount of crush damage and knocking them prone. This is a fantastic combination of crowd control and damage that absolutely devastates groups. Must have, regardless of your build. Disintegration is the best single target damage spell that Ciphers get, and it's a doozy. One enemy within 10 meters is interrupted and takes a massive amount of raw damage over 15 seconds. If the health is reduced to 0, then they completely turn to dust. This thing hits like a truck, and you'll definitely want it against bosses. Moving on to passives, the Empty Soul provides a +10 bonus to accuracy for Cipher spells that target will. If you like the deception spells, then no doubt this is a no-brainer. Moving into PL7, the first ability is Ancestor's Memory, and it's one of the most game-breaking abilities in Deadfire if you hate resting. Target one ally within 16 meters and give them the Brilliant Inspiration for 12 seconds. Brilliant will, among other things, provide one additional rank of all class resources every 6 seconds. This means your wizard can lay down level 9 spells with complete disregard, knowing they'll get the castings right back. Of course, resting is free, so this is all rather unnecessary, but the option is there if you want it. Screaming Souls will target a spirit or vessel within 6 meters and cause them, along with any other spirits or vessels within 5 meters, to emit a deafening scream that deals raw damage to anyone within 2.5 meters, along with making them distracted. Technically this isn't bad, but the obvious issue is you need to be facing a spirit or vessel for the spell to even matter. You can get around this by summoning such a creature with your chanter or using a figurine if it's available, but personally I would skip this. Status Shell targets one enemy within 10 meters, making them stunned and untargetable for 20 seconds. Keep in mind, while you cannot target them directly, they can still take damage from area of effects. No doubt this is a great way to take one enemy off the table temporarily, but at this stage you should have better ways to debuff your foes, and I would skip it. Moving on to passives, the Complete Self provides a +5 bonus to focus whenever you critically hit with a Cipher spell. It's nearly impossible to trigger this consistently, so I would skip it unless you happen to have extra points laying around. Echoing Horror is triggered when you kill an enemy and causes all nearby foes to become frightened. No question, this is fantastic if you are focusing on damage and absolutely should be picked up. Moving on to PL8, Defensive Mind Web is flat out bonkers. For 30 seconds, all nearby allies will be linked, and any incoming damage will have to bypass the highest applicable defense of someone within the group. So if Aloth has 100+ will, then the whole party has 100+ will. This could potentially make your entire team indestructible. If a party member takes damage, they are removed from the web, but it still exists for everyone else. So removing these defenses is a painful process for enemies. Absolutely, this is great to have. Reaping Knives summons pure energy blades that deal raw damage and return 30% of that damage as focus for 30 seconds. If you are playing as a melee Cipher, then no question you will want to pick this up. Time Parasite targets one enemy within 10 meters and then jumps to at most 5 other enemies, reducing their action speed by 25% and giving you a boost of the same amount for each enemy affected. Consequently, your speed can nearly double if you deploy this against a tightly packed group. Action speed will significantly increase how quickly you recover from casting a spell, so this will help you churn out a ton of damage. There is one passive ability here, and it's a Soul's Echo, which converts 15% of your hits into crits with spells that target will. Once again, Deception Ciphers for the win. Finally, we have reached PL9. Driving Echoes targets one ally within 5 meters and provides a +8 bonus to penetration for 24 seconds. +8 penetration is an absolutely massive increase and will help one ally do significantly more damage. Using this on your #1 damage dealer could make it a boss killer, but obviously it's a ton of focus that you have to gear up in order to be able to deploy this. Haunting Chains targets one enemy within 10 meters, terrifying and humbling them for 20 seconds. Again, there are much cheaper ways to apply these debuffs, so I would skip this. Death of 1000 Cuts targets one enemy within 10 meters, interrupts them, deals raw damage, and deals additional raw damage every 3 seconds over a period of 30 seconds. Every time you successfully use a shred spell against this enemy, the duration is increased by 10 seconds and they take another helping of raw damage. This is meant to be a boss killer, but obviously it shines the most against truly brutal bosses that take a long time to go down. There aren't that many of them in the game, so your mileage may vary as to whether or not this spell is worth it. Moving on to the passives, you can take Shared Nightmare to increase your area of effect size based on how much focus you have. If you reach max focus and have taken the passives to increase it, then this is a whopping 120% increase to your area of effect, which is obviously nothing to scoff at. Definitely pick this up. Finally, Protective Soul gives you a 25-point damage shield that lasts for 6 seconds whenever you are critically hit. Unless you are a frontliner, that situation should be rare, and you should have effective ways to deal with it regardless, so I would skip this. Alright, now that we've covered all the abilities, let's briefly talk about multi-classing options. I think it's pretty obvious. Ciphers are incredible at crowd control and spell damage, while there's a little buffing thrown in as well. Multi-classing can help them become sturdier, provide better buffing, or increase their martial might. Keep in mind that when you multi-class, you lose access to the last 2 power levels of both classes, but obviously you are able to take abilities from both of them. While there are some cool options in Cipher's last 2 power levels, I don't consider losing them to be a particular big deal, so this is a great option for multi-classing. The other major consideration is that both classes will advance through PLs much slower. This also isn't a big deal for Ciphers because they get great options early on, so getting the even better options later isn't that big of a sacrifice. Starting from the top, Barbarians and Ciphers mixed together create a Witch. This is especially deadly if you go the Soul Blade route, as Soul Annihilation will deal tremendous melee damage, while your Ciphers high intellect rank will help Carnage reach that many more enemies. Both playstyles benefit from using two-handed weapons, so this combo works extremely well. Your party member Seraphim can become a witch. A Chanter multi-class creates a Spiritualist, which is one of the most potent buffing and debuffing classes in the game. Between your invocations and the wide array of Cipher spells, you can make your party significantly more tanky while also shutting down enemy groups. A Druid multi-class creates an Oracle. The fantastic healing from Druids make a melee Cipher much more viable, while high intelligence will increase the stun duration from the Druid's very powerful storm spells. A Fighter multi-class creates a Side Blade. Similar to Barbarian, this combination gets a lot out of Soul Annihilation, except Fighter will help make you significantly more tanky as opposed to dealing more area of effect damage. A Monk multi-class creates a Transcendent, and once again, a Soul Blade can really shine here. Ascendant is also great because you can attack to build focus and wounds, burn Cipher spells once you are ascended, and then use Monk abilities with whatever wounds you have accumulated. This is great stuff and can work very well. A Paladin multi-class creates an Inquisitor, which is one of the tankiest playthroughs you can have in the entire game, combining Paladin's monster passives and unique team auras with fantastic Cipher buffs. A Priest multi-class creates a Mystic, which provides you with a character who is capable of laying down both incredible large-scale afflictions and amazing team-wide inspirations. Truly, you will be able to control the entire battlefield. A Ranger multi-class creates a Seer, and this is super cool because most ciphers benefit from operating at range, and dealing higher damage will help you rack up focus faster. Ranger passes will help significantly with this. A Rogue multi-class creates a Mind Stalker. Usually rogues need other companions to set enemies up for sneak attacks, but this combo can make great use of Cipher afflictions to the point you only need party members for buffing and to keep the heat off of you. Finally, a Wizard multi-class creates a Hierophant, and personally, I don't care for this combo because spell damage doesn't generate focus. You could use wizard buffs to make your melee cipher tankier, or vice versa if you're going for a summon weapon build, but overall, I just don't think this combo is worth it. Alright, finally I want to get into the build, but first let me take a second to thank all of my YouTube members, Twitch subscribers, and patrons for their support. I really appreciate it. If any of you were looking to join, there's more information in the description, along with a link to my merch store in case any of you would prefer to support in that manner. Alright, now that you have all the ins and outs regarding Cipher, let's review a build. I've never played a Cipher who leans into deception, but after reviewing the mechanics, that sounds like a lot of fun and how I would like to play this class next time. As far as race, let's go ahead and go with Wood Elf, since that +1 to dexterity and perception will come in handy, and resistance against an affliction is always nice. I'll go single class, and for the subclass I would choose Beguiler, which is going to make it much more viable to use Ringleader and its friends. Those spells can help you really shut down enemy groups, so this should be a ton of fun. For attributes, I'm going to go with 14 in might to ensure our weapons deal decent damage, and then I will reduce constitution to 8 because most of the time your enemies should be fighting each other and you can cast deception spells from a nice safe distance. Dexterity and perception should be at 17 so you can quickly throw out your spells and be sure they will actually land, while intelligence is at 18 so your enemies will stay deceived as long as possible. As usual, resolve can be completely dumped. For culture, I take a deer just because it makes sense for a wood elf to have come from there. The +1 to resolve doesn't really help you, and I would take the hunter background as a +1 bonus to mechanics will help ensure all traps and locks can be easily cleared. At first, I would take the hunting bow proficiency, but long term, I definitely like using the kitchen stove blunderbuss to annihilate large groups of enemies and help me quickly rack up focus. Alright, now let's look at the abilities. Obviously, you automatically get Soul Whip, and I'll have the Beguiler here as well. Of course, since we're a Beguiler, I'm going to want to take Whisper of Treason. It's going to allow me to charm enemies. It's going to be extremely useful early in the game. And remember, once again, that even though it says the range is 4, it'll actually be longer because I have Beguiler as my subclass. I'll also go ahead and take Eye Strike. It's very important that you're putting those afflictions on enemies so that they are susceptible to sneak attacks, and so that you'll generate focus just by using your deception spells on them. So Eye Strike is very powerful the entire game and will help us do that. And then we're going to go ahead and also take Iron Will, which will give us a +15 bonus to will. That's going to be very, very important later in the game, so you don't have to prioritize this high on the list, but at some point before we get Defensive Mind Web, you want to make sure you pick this up. I'll also go ahead and pick up Lingering Echoes. You absolutely want to prioritize that. It's going to give you that +10% bonus to affliction duration. Keep those enemies charmed and dominated for longer. At PL2, we're absolutely going to take Mental Binding. It's going to allow us to paralyze and immobilize enemies. Great stuff. And then we're going to take the Draining Whip upgrade to Soul Whip, and it's going to allow us to generate even more focus. We're also going to take One-Handed Style. Once again, I prefer to use a blunderbuss. That's a one-handed weapon, and so this ability is going to help ensure that we do even more damage when using that style. At PL3, we're going to go ahead and pick up Secret Horrors. It's going to allow us for a large group of enemies to give them all the Frightened and Sickened statuses, which when we combo it with another deception spell that hits multiple enemies, such as Mental Binding, is going to really allow you to rack up that focus and make sure that you always have enough focus to cast whatever spells that you want to. Sooner or later, we're going to want to do some damage that's not just martial, so I like picking up Ecto-Psychic Echo. It's going to allow us to just place it on Adair or whatever frontliner we're using, have that beam going around and destroying the enemies who get too close. And then of course we're also going to pick up Puppet Puppet Master so that we have the ability to dominate single targets. Moving on to PL4, we're going to go ahead and get Silent Scream, which is going to let us stun one enemy while also doing a bunch of damage and interrupting nearby enemies. Great stuff from both a crowd control and damage standpoint. And of course, we're going to also take Greater Focus, which will give us a +10 bonus to both maximum and starting focus. Great stuff. At PL5, we'll take Ringleader, creme de la creme of deception spells. It's going to allow us to dominate one enemy while charming all the other ones, completely shutting down enemy groups. Just fantastic stuff to have. And then, of course, we're going to want Keen Mind for that +10 bonus to how much focus we actually start combat with. We'll also go ahead and take Rapid Casting so we can cast all these spells significantly faster. And then we're also going to take Far Casting, which is going to further increase the range at which we can deploy those deception spells. At PL6, we're going to go ahead and, of course, take Amplified Wave. Even though it's not a deception spell, it's just too great not to take. It's going to do tremendous damage to a wide group of enemies while also hopefully knocking them down prone. And we'll go ahead and pick up Disintegration because sometimes it's just a single target we need to work with. And in those cases, Disintegration is going to do a lot more damage over this period of time. So this is great stuff. And then as far as passives, we'll go ahead and take Empty Soul. We're going to get a +10 accuracy bonus when using Cipher spells that target will. Obviously, it's going to help us ensure that those spells connect. Really, really awesome stuff. Then moving on to PL7, we're going to go ahead and pick up Echoing Horror. Now, we don't necessarily kill a whole lot of enemies, considering we're focusing so much on crowd control. But every so often, that blunderbuss is going to punch through. And when that happens, this will be nice. So you don't need to put it high on the priority list, but just make sure you pick it up at some point. And then we're also going to go ahead and get Accurate Empower. Empowering your deception spells is going to really ensure that enemies remain dominated or charmed for an extended period of time. So this is great stuff. And then finally, we'll also put on Lasting Empower. So even more reason to empower your deception spells constantly. They're going to last even longer and be more accurate. Then moving on to PL8, we have, of course, Defensive Mind Web. I've already talked about how awesome this ability is, and it's the reason why you want to make sure you take Iron Will, because most likely your Cipher will have the largest will score on your entire team, so it'll be responsible in this mind web for making sure will is as high as possible. And then we're going to want to go ahead and pick up Time Parasite. Absolutely amazing when deployed against large groups. It's going to make your Cipher lightning fast, and you'll be able to just throw out those spells back to back to back. Then we'll also get a Soul's Echo, which is going to increase by 15% how often your hits are converted to crits, which are Cipher spells that target will. And remember, getting a crit with a spell that is crowd control is still fantastic because it's going to extend the duration that it lasts. So crits are important even if you're not actually attacking the enemy. And then finally, with PL9, we're going to go ahead and get Death of 1,000 Cuts, which is going to help us that much more when we're dealing with bosses who have already been thoroughly debuffed. We can put this on, and then we just hammer them with Disintegrate over and over again until they die. And then finally, the last passive that we'll pick up is Shared Nightmare. The Cipher's area effects increase in size the more focus the Cipher has. And by this point, you should be able to stack up quite a bit of focus. So this will significantly increase how large your area of effects actually are. So that's the build, and overall, I would rank this class an S. Cipher is once again one of the most powerful options you can select. Crowd control abilities that render most encounters trivial are combined with very respectable damage options. All of these spells can be used again and again, allowing Cipher to be highly effective even during long encounters at the end of massive dungeons. There's just a whole lot to like about this kit. That ends my ranking of Cipher, but please leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you disagree with any of my commentary? Would you have changed where I ranked the class? If you enjoyed this video, please, one more time, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be dropping more content that's just like this. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.